Likely that in September, the administration certified that the Saudis and Emiratis were indeed taking these steps, these so-called demonstrable actions to reduce civilian deaths. The administration simply could have waived the requirement. The law allowed that, but they didn't. They essentially told us not to believe our eyes. Let me be clear. We have real strategic interests in that part of the world. Iran continues to destabilize the region, and their support for the Houthis is only part of their strategy to bleed their regional adversaries. But I do not support providing assistance that we know is being used to kill civilians. And so if the administration won't demand any sort of accountability from the Saudis and Emiratis, the work then falls to the Congress. The Pentagon cut off refueling as a matter of policy, but that could be reversed at any time. This resolution would cut off refueling as a matter of law. It also sends a clear message to the administration, to our partners in the Gulf, and to our adversaries that Congress won't sit back and shirk our responsibilities when it comes to foreign policy. It's time to have the debates about how, when, and where the U.S. military is engaged around the world. This resolution is sparking that debate. So I will support moving this measure to the floor, and at this time I will yield to the ranking member for any comments he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a tremendous respect for the chair, but I must say this first markup is I think, a departure from the strongly bipartisan cooperation that we've enjoyed on this committee. I believe that this committee does have a solemn responsibility to appropriately exercise congressional war powers under Article 1 of the Constitution. But the mechanism to force withdrawal of U.S. forces under the War Powers Act applies only when we are engaged in live-fire hostilities. This is not the case here. This is not what our military is doing currently in Yemen. This resolution would set a very dangerous precedent. Are we now going to allow any member to use this privileged war powers tool to second-guess all U.S. security cooperation agreements throughout the world? This interpretation could impact our assistance to Israel. It could impact our cooperation with African nations in the Sahel. We could recklessly undo critical security relationships we have spent decades building. This is not what the War Powers Resolution has ever meant, and it should not be used this way now. A vote in favor is a victory for bad policy. As we heard at this morning's hearing, the situation in Yemen poses critical strategic and humanitarian issues that deserve careful attention. If we want to discuss conditioning assistance to Saudi Arabia in this conflict, that is an area we can explore and debate. But this resolution is trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole. It misuses an extraordinary war powers tool to try to get at the issue of security assistance to a third country. Even our aerial refueling of Saudi jets, which does not constitute hostilities as traditionally understood, ended last November. And I spoke with Defense Department representatives yesterday who reaffirmed that U.S. forces are not engaged in hostilities against Houthi forces in Yemen. They confirmed the continuing accuracy of the detailed letter sent to Congress last year by the department's acting general counsel. No one is saying that U.S. security assistance to Saudi Arabia or anyone else is beyond congressional scrutiny. We have many tools to use, including this committee's arms sales notifications, targeted legislation, and the annual appropriations process, among others. But this resolution stretches the definition of hostilities to cover non-U.S. military operations by other countries. It reinterprets U.S. support to those countries as engagement in hostility. This has implications far beyond Saudi Arabia. Under this model, if any member of Congress doesn't like something that any of our security partners does overseas, that member can force quick consideration of a resolution directing the removal of U.S. forces from hostilities, quote, in or affecting, unquote, that situation. It no longer matters that U.S. forces are not actually conducting those hostilities. The bill is vague and irresponsible. It will create doubts for our partners and allies around the world. It will trouble the many Americans who believe the burden sharing with capable allies is vital for U.S. national security. And for that reason, I oppose this measure. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to place into the record 3 documents. One, the January 2019 Department of Defense report to Congress concerning our similar acquisition and cross-servicing activities with over 117 nations around the world, including our NATO allies, CT partners in the Sahel, Israel, and others. 2, the November 28, 2018 statement of the administration policy opposing SJ Res 54 because, quote, the United States forces are not engaged in hostilities between the Saudi-led coalition and Houthi forces in Yemen, unquote. And third, the February 27, 2018 letter from the Department of Defense Office of General Counsel explaining the legal and security concerns posed by the approach used by today's resolution. I ask unanimous consent to place those in the record.
Without objection, so moved.
And I thank the chairman for that. And again, I oppose this measure, and I yield back my time.
The ranking member yields back. Does any other member seek recognition on the resolution? I'm told Mr. Connolly does. Mr.
Thank you,
Connolly.
Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the juridical distinction made by the ranking member that the United States is not technically involved on the ground in hostilities. But the United States most certainly has been involved in equipping, re-equipping, training, and other support for the Saudi activity in Yemen that has led to one of the greatest humanitarian crises on the face of the planet. And that's what we're trying to address today. We can hide behind juridical language that it's not technically a combat involvement of the United States, but it begs the question. Since 2015, the United States has provided support to the Saudi-led coalition in its war against Houthi rebels in Yemen. In addition to claiming an estimated 60,000 Yemeni lives, this war is fueling the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Humanitarian agencies now estimate that 85,000 children have died from malnutrition. More than half the population currently requires emergency food assistance, and 1 in every 10 Yemeni children has been forcibly displaced from his or her home due to this conflict. In 2017, in September 2018, Secretary Pompeo certified to this Congress that the Saudi and Emirati governments were mitigating harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure in Yemen. Meanwhile, the Saudi-led coalition has conducted attacks, killing dozens of civilians at a time, often with U.S.-provided munitions, belying the certification made in September of 2018. Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution states unequivocally, Congress shall have the power to declare war and to raise and support armies and other armed forces. I would argue, just as the executive branch says there are implied powers in the role of commander-in-chief, certainly there are implied powers about our ability to stop military interventions as we deem fit. Article 1 says so, as far as I'm concerned. Pursuant to the War Powers Resolution, PL 93-148, the President must remove U.S. armed forces engaged in hostilities outside U.S. territory without a specific statutory authorization if Congress so directs. And I would argue that that's a broad authority for Congress. It doesn't necessarily mean U.S. combat troops on the ground. Support for ongoing hostilities by a third power, an ally, certainly qualify as far as I am concerned.
With the gentleman lead, we're concerned that there's time running out. There's 37 seconds left. So
I support the resolution in front of us. I believe Congress needs to reclaim its congressional power, and I will vote for the resolution pending before this committee. I thank the chair.
I thank the gentleman. The committee will now recess until after votes on the floor. The committee stands in recess.